Hello my friends, and welcome back to another episode of Strange Origins. This week I felt the need to delve into a pretty large topic, just so that I could get some groundwork down for future episodes. Since I assume most people listen to podcast episodes chronologically, I feel responsible to talk about the more influential topics first. I did this a little with my first episode where I talked about vampires, my fifth episode where I discussed fairies, and also my eighth episode, where I got into haunted houses, which are all very broad topics. These episodes serve as foundations for future episodes and even sequel episodes. If you're the type of listener who enjoys skipping to whichever topic interests you the most, I totally get it, and will do my best to section off each episode so that you can enjoy them as individual chapters. The subject of witches is one of those topics that seems to relate to everything else in the supernatural world. I even discussed it a little back in my episode about fairies, so if you haven't listened, be sure to scroll back to that one. Just as an overall definition, witches are women who are thought to have magical abilities. Today they usually are universally recognized as wearing black pointed hats, having moles on their faces, or as flying around on broomsticks. Really though, that's simply just the Americanized version of the thing, popularized by decades of Halloween-themed pop culture. Shows like Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Bewitched, Halloween Town, The Craft, Hocus Pocus, and even The Wizard of Oz have all put an idea of what a witch is supposed to look like into our heads. Their appearance in literature even dates back to religious texts, to Shakespeare, and to Grimm's fairy tales, where they have morphed into the Disney antagonists we know them as today. Thankfully, media has been able to represent at least a few good witches through film and literature in order to help give a more accurate representation of witchcraft. Some of you might recognize the witches from Hallmark's The Good Witch, Practical Magic, or even Casper and Wendy. This dualistic nature of witches is natural, as in history they have been known to practice either light or dark versions of magic. Misconception, as is present with a lot of the subjects I talk about, is pretty strong when it comes to witches. This is evident when you realize that in the 90s and early 2000s, people gathered in order to burn books from the Harry Potter series. While the books are fictional and fantasy-based and tell the story of a young boy fighting against evil, people are still more than willing to accuse writer J.K. Rowling of propagating dark magic and Satanism. This confusion most likely occurred due to the fact that witches are almost always visualized as practitioners of dark magic, while a majority of magic through history, including that which is practiced today, has been white magic. The main difference lies in the fact that white, which is also referred to as right-hand magic, is used for selfless purposes. Those witches adhere to a moral code, believing that what you put out into the world is what you will receive back, and black magic, which is also called left-hand magic, focuses more on the breaking of taboos, such as with the use of sex magic or satanic imagery. Black magic practitioners are known for invoking demons or other spirits who wish to do harm, or by cursing or hexing people. Back when farm success meant life or death for a majority of people, they were also known to destroy crops. They also are known to engage in devil worship in order to gain or strengthen powers. Contrastingly, white magic is used more as a way to help out others, such as the curing of illnesses, dream interpretation, or the locating of lost objects, the appeasing of angry spirits, or the controlling of the weather for good crops. Historically speaking, witches show up in just about every culture, in their own fashion, and have had an exceptionally intense effect on society through the years. Even today, witch camps, where women and children go for refuge if they are suspected of having magical abilities, exist in places like West Africa. Severe backlash from religions have made it so that witchcraft is a pretty secretive affair. It's often noted that practicing witches in the modern age tell very few people, referring to themselves as, quote, in the broom closet, until they choose to reveal themselves to someone they trust. So, while a lot of witchcraft that is practiced today is closer to paganism than Satanism, most people in the modern age dismiss all versions of witchcraft, not taking the time to differentiate whether a witch practices light or dark magic before making assumptions about their beliefs or actions. So, if real-life witches throughout history haven't been all that bad, where exactly did the vision of a crusty, cantankerous old woman come from? To help you understand, I'll have to explain a few things first, such as why magic was such a popular concept thousands of years ago. While not a lot can be found to have been written down about witches themselves for another few millennia, proof can be found of people protecting themselves against witchcraft as far back as around 3000 BC. In what is today southern Iraq, documents carved into stone were found that instructed one on how to get rid of a sickness thought to be caused by evil intent. At the time, it was common for illnesses to be blamed on witchcraft, so to fight the sickness, a maklu would be made, a word which translates to mean burning. Written in Akkadian, which is now an extinct language, the directions were carved into 8 tablets. It guided the sick through a lengthy ceremony that could only be performed in a single night around what is now July or August. This was thought to be when spirits traveled the most between worlds, and when they would be at their most vulnerable. The ritual was made up of 3 separate stages. The first involved taking figurines of the witch or sorcerer who initially cursed the sick, burning them, drowning them in a black liquid, and crushing them face down into the ground, while the first 4 tablets were to be recited. The second phase involved fumigating the household and massaging the sick, while tablets 5 to 7 were read. The last stage involved washing the patient in the early hours of the morning, while reciting the rest of the phrases. After invoking the protection of a sun god, it was important that the sick looked at the reflection in a bowl of pure water while saying, quote, "You are my reflection. You are mine, and I am yours. May nobody know you. May no evil approach you." End quote. About 1,000 years later, it was ancient Egypt that became revered for their use of witchcraft. Lector priests, a certain type of priest that was also known to protect the pharaoh of Egypt at the time, were known to help out the spirits of the dead as they traveled to their next life, waiting to be reborn again. About another 1,000 years later in Egypt, it became the healers who were famous for their skills of magic. This included scorpion charmers who used magic to rid places of dangerous insects and reptiles, and also nurses and midwives, seeing as the healing arts were also then categorized as a type of witchcraft. As a form of defense, it's noted that these women would use semicircular pieces of ivory with intricate drawings on them as wands that served as symbols of power. It's even thought that during childbirth, these magic midwives would draw a circle around the expectant or nursing mother in order to create a safe area away from ghosts or angry deities. On the wands were carved pictures of dangerous creatures fighting off demons that were symbolized as snakes or foreigners. If you want to see pictures, be sure to check out my Instagram page at Strange Origins Podcast to see examples of these beautiful wands. Around the 1300s in Norse mythology, magic was practiced not only by mythical characters, but also by real people. In Old Norse, there was a type of magic, referred to as saidif, that supposedly allowed one to tell or shape the future. They were referred to as prophecy women or magic women, though it's largely unknown how this witchcraft was performed, seeing as the Christianization of Scandinavia would wipe out a lot of records. It's thought that it involved visionary journeys. Something interesting about this type of magic was that while both sexes were permitted to practice it, it was more common for women to be seers, as it was considered taboo for men to have anything to do with it, and would therefore be persecuted as a result. One of the better-known iconic symbols of witchcraft is the triple form of Greek goddesses composed of Diana, Selene, and Hecate. These goddesses would be worshipped as one later on in Greek history, as they were all thought to be kind of the same person, and represented a lot of the same things. Diana, while famously wielding a bow and arrow, is known for being the patroness of chastity, crossroads, and hunters. Selene was the goddess of the moon, and Hecate was the goddess of entranceways, necromancy, ghosts, and witchcraft. She is often depicted along with Diana holding a pair of torches or a key to symbolize that she was chthonic, meaning that she could travel easily from Mount Olympus to the underworld and back again. It was said of her in Lucian's Pharsaly that she was, quote, the goddess we witches revere, seeing as due to her nature as a night owl and traveler to the underworld, she was linked to spirits and witchcraft. She was also described in that work as, quote, a rotting goddess, with a, quote, pallid, decaying body, which might be where some of the characteristics of modern pop culture witches began. She was so grotesque that she was described as having to wear a mask when she visited the gods on Mount Olympus. It was also said of Hecate that, quote, she is more at home on the fringes than in the center of Greek polytheism. Intrinsically ambivalent and polymorphous, she straddles conventional boundaries and eludes definition, end quote. Which, in my opinion, is the perfect definition of what a true witch is. Another literary proponent of the idea of witchcraft was a woman named Erichtho. She was a legendary Thessalian witch who appeared in more than one work and was noted for her, quote, horrifying appearance and impious ways. She also showed up in Roman poet Lucian's epic Pharsalia, which was essentially about a civil war that was happening at the time between Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar. In it, Pompey the Great's son, Sextus Pompeius, sought out the witch Erichtho so as to ask her to reveal the future and tell him what was to happen at an upcoming battle. She proceeded to give him what he wanted by finding the dead body of a soldier, filling it with potions, and raising it from the dead. The corpse then described Pompey's defeat, but Caesar's eventual assassination. Within the Old Testament, which was written at different times between 1200 and 65 BC, witches are directly named 13 times, both in reference to female witches and also male ones. In a story that sounds a lot like the one involving Erichtho, the Bible tells of the experience of Saul with the witch of Endor. The king of Israel at the time, Saul, sought help in knowing what to do in a war with the Philistines. Unable to get answers from dreams, prophets, or even the device known as the Urim and Thummim, he desperately went searching for a witch with who to consult. He went in disguise, seeing as he had just driven out all witches, soothsayers, and necromancers from Israel, and was therefore not very popular among them. In his search, he found the witch of Endor. The woman helped him in his quest by talking to the ghost of the king who served before Saul, whose name was Samuel. After berating Saul for disobeying God, which is a complicated backstory involving the future King David, he prophesied that Saul would die the next day in battle, along with his sons. After collapsing in fear, the witch fed and comforted him. He went into battle the next day to have 3 of his sons die in combat, and for him to fall onto his own sword to avoid capture. Ironically enough, Samantha's aunt, Andorra, from the popular television show Bewitched, was named after the Witch of Endor as a way to draw Christian viewers in. Besides the story of the Witch of Endor, little is said about witches except for 2 very damning verses. The first is listed in Deuteronomy 18:11-12, that states that anyone who, quote, casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead, anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you, end quote. It also stated in Exodus 22:18, quote, do not allow a sorceress to live, which was translated in the King James Bible as, quote, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Today it has been suggested by modern translators that the word witch might just have been a mistranslation of the word prisoner. In later times, this commandment would be used as a way to not only punish those seriously thought to practice witchcraft, but also as an excuse to eradicate anyone who didn't fit into pre-made boxes. While I will be sure to do an episode dedicated to witch hunts, as it is far too large of a subject to fit into this episode, it's important to state that religious text wasn't the largest motivation for the mass slaying of witches in the past 1,000 years or so. Though religious texts mention both men and women as having performed witchcraft, it was the writer of the book titled Witch's Hammer, or Malleus Maleficarum, that made the public disproportionately target women, and target them hard. Written in 1487 by a monk named Heinrich Kramer, the book became extremely popular, only being outsold in Europe by the Bible for almost 2 centuries. It was even so well known that it's thought that Shakespeare used it to create the characters of the Weird Sisters in Macbeth, who are staple spooky characters, and who have ultimately helped to cement what pop culture witches look like today. In the book, Kramer stated that since the apocalypse would happen soon, that Satan himself caused, quote, a certain unusual heretical perversity to grow up in the land of the Lord, a heresy, I say, of sorceresses, since it is designated by the particular gender of which he, Satan, is known to have power, end quote. Essentially, the book outlined, in the most misogynistic way possible, why women were much more susceptible to Satan's willpower, and therefore were more likely to become witches. He especially vilified women in that he listed, among the powers that female witches could possess, the ability to make a man impotent, or even to make his penis smaller. It essentially, through use of male-targeted scare tactics, called for a war against them. Religious leaders first approved of the text, then quickly took back what they had said, seeing what kind of an effect it had on people. The approval had already done damage, though, as witch hunts had begun. The book was so popular that not even the church taking back their approval swayed anyone much. It ultimately led to witch hunts that would last for hundreds of years across several continents and kill hundreds of thousands of people, mostly women. One reason that the prejudice against women became so swift was that it was written in the book that women had, quote, slippery tongues and are unable to conceal from the fellow women those things which by evil arts they know. And since they are weak, they find an easy and secret manner of vindicating themselves by witchcraft, end quote. Simply put, he stated that since women are known to gossip, that they would more swiftly bring about the end of the world through witchcraft. Therefore, the only option was to exterminate them. As it's well known and recorded, colonial America suffered from a pretty severe case of paranoia when it came to witches. What a lot don't realize, though, is that there were even witch hunts before Salem, which would serve to set the stage and strengthen the resolve people had for witch hunts, that would later make the Salem witch hunts the historically relevant dumpster fire it was. One story that caught my eye reading about these hunts was that of Mary Johnson. After years of torture and detainment, where under extreme duress she stated that she had, quote, familiarity with the devil, Mary was recorded as having given the first confession of witchcraft in the colonies. She was later hung at the gallows. Things got so bad that at one point during the frenzy, women could even be blamed for the actions of a man and be labeled as a user of witchcraft. In one such case, a woman named Lydia Gilbert was convicted after a man accidentally shot and killed another man. Thankfully, the courts began to become bored of witchcraft trials, seeing far too often that many of them were the result of petty feuds between people that had escalated. It seemed everyone was more than ready to blame their misfortunes on witchcraft, or solve their problems with it. In another interesting case, it's recorded that a man named Hugh Crotia claimed that he had, quote, made a pact with the devil and practiced black magic against his fellow citizens, end quote. While I'm not sure if he was known for being the village idiot or just wanted attention, the court pardoned him, declaring that he was, quote, an ignoramus. In the last century or so, witchcraft, while morphing back into its more pagan form of worship, has become a sort of pop culture stance against misogyny. There are still, of course, the classic evil witches that are portrayed everywhere from Disney to horror films, such as in the Blair Witch Project. The film terrified audiences with its found footage style in 1999 and made people afraid to camp in the woods, even though the titular witch was never even seen in the film. It's just simply that audiences have been taught enough about the stereotypical witch to be made afraid and wary. As for the pointy hat and broomstick, it's thought by some that the image came from modern artistic imaginings, while others like to point to history for an explanation. It's thought that in the 1500s, pointed hats were frowned upon by the church because they reminded people of the devil's horns. Others say that Puritans, who were famous for burning witches in the colonies, wore steeple-crowned hats, which looked a bit more like the ones with a buckle on them in those depictions of Thanksgiving pilgrims. It's thought that they would put one of these hats on witches before they were burned so as to help draw out their sins, seeing as steeple-crowned hats looked like the top of a church. As for the broomstick, it's thought that midwives, who were also often tried as witches, would put a broomstick outside of their windows to let other midwives know that their house was a safe haven. Others think that it's because a popular superstition claimed that to get bad intentions and evil spirits out of your home, you had to sweep them out. Another story claims that witches would perform magic on their garden by riding a broomstick and jumping over the plants so as to encourage them to grow. The most popular idea behind the broomstick comes from the early modern period, which lasted from 1500 to 1800 AD. It stated that witches could fly only in their minds through the use of a hallucinogenic drug called flying ointment. English philosopher and statesman Francis Bacon wrote that the ingredients of the witch's ointment included, quote, the fat of children dug out of their graves, of juices of smallage, which is another name for celery, wolf's bane, and cinquefoil, mingled with the meal of fine wheat. Some of these ingredients, when eaten, were highly poisonous. Attempts at recreating the flying ointment even resulted in the death of historian and occultist Karl Kaisvetter in 1895. Today, women are taking back the title of witch, which before was a label that could have you burned at the stake or driven out of your homeland. A lot of women who were persecuted were those that weren't seen as having a connection to a man who could protect them, such as widows or those who had been through menopause and could no longer contribute children to the world. At first, witchcraft was used as a title of blame to put on someone for things that were out of everyone's control, such as the death of a child, a crop failure, or an illness. That morphed into misogynistic oppression, and back again to empowerment, for both men and women. Today, most witches practice Wicca, which has a lot of different variations and offshoots, and is generally referred to as pagan witchcraft. With no central authority figure, members are usually polytheistic, can adhere to the rules of other religions alongside it, and celebrations center around moon or sun cycles. Generally, their craft focuses on healing, setting good intentions, and working alongside nature. Anthropologist Susan Greenwood said of Wiccan rituals that they were, quote, a form of resistance to mainstream culture, and that they were, quote, a healing space away from the ills of the wider culture, where female practitioners can redefine and empower themselves, end quote. So what does the future of witchcraft hold? In my opinion, it's fun to have crusty and malicious images of an old woman in the woods cooking stew out of body parts. Growing up, I was a witch for Halloween more than once, simply because it was an easy outfit to put together. I owned a lot of black clothes. And as a kid, it's fun to pretend that you really have magic powers. In real life, though, I'm glad that true witchcraft is beginning to separate itself from harmful stereotypes, and that more and more people are beginning to understand what it means to be a witch in this day and age. While I don't doubt that truly evil magic exists out there, it's detrimental to state that all craft is evil. As J.K. Rowling wrote, we've all got both light and dark inside us. What matters is the part we choose to act on. Though I personally don't practice, it's empowering to see women on social media who use it as a form of positive self-expression and empowerment. In a world where women make up the majority of victims in both personal and random acts of violence, it's one of my favorite quotes about witches from the book Wintersmith that states this: a witch ought never be frightened in the darkest forest, because she should be sure in her soul that the most terrifying thing in the forest was her. As this episode comes to a close, I would like to thank my listeners for supporting my dream job. Without you, I would just be someone talking into a microphone at 2 a.m. in my parents' basement, like a crazy person. But still, I would love to have more to talk about. Please email me at strangeoriginspodcast@gmail.com and tell me what it is about this week's topic that interested you, your suggestions for future episodes, or even stories of your own experiences with the strange and unexplained. If you would like to help this podcast grow, allowing me to make bigger, better episodes, be sure to click the follow button or even give it a 5-star rating if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. If you're feeling bougie, you can also donate to my Patreon page, which is linked in the description. You can donate any amount, and each tier of donation receives great gifts like shoutouts, stickers, and even exclusive episodes. Or, if you're poor like me and would just like to enjoy more spooky stuff, be sure to follow my Instagram page at Strange Origins Podcast. And if you know of a friend, a sibling, a coworker, or a pet dog who would love to listen to my podcast, send them a link. It would be greatly appreciated. Be safe out there, but more importantly, guys, remember to keep it strange.